The woman who destroyed a billionaire's empire and revealed the biggest corporate scandal of the century. In an explosive shocker that will rock Wall Street, an ordinary woman has become the nightmare of one of the most powerful men in the corporate world. Daniel Goldstein, untouchable billionaire, has been completely dismantled by Rachel, who has turned his silence into a weapon of mass destruction. Exclusive revelations that will make you question everything you know about power, corruption, and justice. How did a single woman manage to bring down an empire worth millions in weeks? Confidential documents, shocking witnesses, a network of manipulation that will leave you speechless. What Rachel did went beyond revenge. It was revolution. A story that will prove that the truth always finds its way, no matter how many obstacles there are. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The ballroom of the Ritz Hotel sparkled under the glitter of 1,000 crystals. New York's elite gathered for yet another gala event, a sea of designer dresses and impeccable tuxedos. A mixture of expensive perfumes and unspoken expectations hung in the air. The doors opened with a dramatic flourish, and all eyes turned to the couple who had just entered. Daniel Goldstein, the Jewish billionaire whose fortune was the subject of urban legends, entered the room with his wife, Rachel. By his side, he, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She, ethereal in a midnight blue silk dress, seemed to float beside him, a delicate, almost fragile smile on her lips. The whispers started immediately. "Look at them," murmured one woman to her companion. "So perfect. Almost unreal." "He looks so powerful," replied the other. "But her. There's something in her eyes. Don't you think?" Rachel felt the stares like needles on her skin. Her smile never faltered. But something in her eyes, a glint of apprehension, perhaps betrayed an untold story. Daniel, oblivious or indifferent to his wife's discomfort, guided her through the hall with a firm hand on her back, his fingers pressing a little harder than necessary. The couple moved among the guests, exchanging greetings and rehearsed smiles. Rachel felt every muscle in her face tense with the effort of maintaining the facade. Her mind wandered, recalling the argument they had moments before leaving the house. "Don't embarrass me tonight, Rachel," Daniel had said, his voice low and threatening. "You know how important this event is to me." Now, as she smiled and waved, Rachel fought against the wave of anxiety that threatened to engulf her. Every laugh, every touch, every glance exchanged with Daniel was a carefully choreographed performance. The evening progressed, and the moment Rachel had been dreading finally arrived. Daniel took to the small stage to give his speech, his face illuminated by spotlights and adoration. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice resonating through the now silent hall. "It's an honor to be here with you, celebrating not only the success of our ventures, but also the generosity that allows us to give back to the community." Rachel watched from her seat in the front row, her heart racing with every word. She knew this public Daniel well, charismatic, eloquent, seemingly benevolent. How different he was from the man she knew at home. "And of course," Daniel continued, his gaze meeting Rachel's, "none of this would be possible without the unconditional support of my beloved wife, Rachel." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Rachel felt her smile falter for a moment, then quickly regained it. Daniel's words rang hollow in her ears, each compliment a veiled stab that only she could feel. "Rachel, my love," Daniel said, his voice mellifluous, "why don't you join me here on stage?" Rachel's heart stopped for an instant. This wasn't planned. On shaky legs, she stood up and walked towards her husband, feeling the weight of the stares from everyone present. Daniel welcomed her with a hug that seemed loving to the onlookers, but which for Rachel was like being wrapped in cold currents. He turned to her, still holding the microphone, a smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Rachel, darling, why don't you say a few words? Tell everyone how wonderful it's been to be by my side on this journey." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel looked at the crowd, then at Daniel, his face a mask of barely disguised panic. It was at this moment that she realized tonight was going to be different. Something was about to change, and she had no idea if she was prepared for what came next. The microphone felt as heavy in Rachel's hand as if it were made of lead. Her gaze wandered over the expectant crowd, curious faces and polite smiles staring back at her. For a brief moment, she felt transported back to the stage of her old life, before Daniel, when her voice was her own. She began, hesitantly. A flash of memory hit her Daniel, shouting at her the night before for expressing an opinion during a dinner with investors. She swallowed and continued. I'm honored to be here tonight. Daniel smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Come on, darling, tell everyone about our wonderful wedding. Rachel's words got stuck in her throat. Instead, images of years of veiled criticism, subtle manipulations and gradual isolation flooded her mind. She forced a smile. Daniel is an extraordinary man. His success speaks for itself. A murmur of approval ran through the audience, but Rachel noticed confused looks on some faces. Was it possible that others could see through the facade? Daniel, sensing Rachel's hesitation, intervened gently. My wife is too modest. Rachel has been my safe haven, my inspiration. He hugged her, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave a mark. As Daniel continued his speech, Rachel let her mind wander. She remembered the day she met Daniel 10 years ago. She was a promising environmental lawyer, passionate and idealistic. Daniel had wooed her with intensity, promising her the world. Gradually, he convinced her to leave her job, claiming that she could do more good alongside him. The sound of applause brought Rachel back to the present. Daniel guided her back to the table, his arm firmly around her waist. You almost ruined everything, he whispered, his breath hot in her ear. Smile. We have an image to maintain. Rachel obeyed automatically, years of conditioning kicking in. As they walked among the guests, she noticed sympathetic glances from some of the women. Would they be able to see past the facade? Rachel, long time no see. A familiar voice made her turn around. It was Michael, an old college classmate. His face lit up with a genuine smile for the first time in the evening. Michael, what a wonderful surprise. The orchestra was playing a soft waltz, its chords floating through the hall like a fragrant breeze. Daniel took Rachel's hand firmly, pulling her onto the dance floor. Her movements were graceful, rehearsed, a perfect performance for the eager eyes of the guests. Smile, darling, Daniel murmured, his lips close to Rachel's ear. You know how important it is to keep up appearances. Rachel forced a smile, feeling as if her face was made of porcelain about to crack. As she swirled in Daniel's arms, her mind wandered to the not-so-distant past. 5 years ago, Rachel was a promising architect, about to open her own studio. Her encounter with Daniel had been like a hurricane, intense, overwhelming, leaving her breathless. He wooed her with dinners in starred restaurants, weekend trips, in his private jet, promises of a bright future together. You won't have to work, my love, he had said. Let me take care of you. At the time, it had sounded like a fairy tale. Now, spinning around in the ballroom, Rachel realized that she had traded her independence for a gilded cage. The music stopped, and Daniel led her back to the table. I'm going to talk to some investors, he said, his tone making it clear that she should stay where she was. Behave yourself. Alone, Rachel surveyed the room. She saw smiling faces, heard laughter, smelled expensive. Champagne, it all seemed so fake. Her gaze landed on a glass of red wine, and she picked it up, bringing it to her lips with an urgency that surprised her. Rachel, is that you? The voice startled her. Turning around, she saw a familiar face, Michael, a colleague from architecture school. His eyes lit up with genuine recognition. Michael. What a wonderful surprise, she replied, feeling a wave of relief at seeing a friendly face. How long? How's your career going? I heard you were about to open your own studio. The innocent question hit Rachel like a punch in the gut. Well, things have changed a bit, she stammered, feeling the weight of her choices. Before she could elaborate, Daniel's hand landed heavily on her shoulder. Honey, who's your friend? The question sounded casual, but Rachel sensed the underlying threat. Daniel, this is Michael, an old classmate from college, she introduced, trying to keep her voice steady. Charmed, said Daniel, his handshake a little too strong. If you'll excuse us, I need to steal my wife for a moment. Daniel guided her to a more private corner of the room, his smile disappearing as soon as they were out of sight. What did I say? About talking to strangers, Rachel? He hissed. He's not a stranger, Daniel. He's an old friend. Friend? Daniel laughed humorlessly. Don't be naive. Men like him are only interested in one thing, and you know it. Rachel felt a spark of defiance ignite in her chest. Maybe he was just being nice. You remember what kindness is, don't you, Daniel? Daniel's gaze hardened. Watch your tone, darling. Don't remind me of your place. With that, he walked away, leaving Rachel shaking with anger and humiliation. She headed for the bathroom, needing a moment of solitude. In the luxurious ladies' room, Rachel found a young woman sobbing quietly in one of the cubicles. She hesitated for a moment before knocking softly on the door. Is everything all right? In there? The door opened slowly, revealing a woman of about 25 with smudged makeup and red eyes. Sorry, she mumbled. I didn't mean to disturb anyone. Rachel felt a wave of empathy. Don't worry. Can I help you with something? The young woman hesitated before speaking. It's just my boyfriend. Hess. He's not who I thought he was. The words hit Rachel with unexpected force. I understand, she said softly. More than you realize. For a few minutes, the two women talked, sharing experiences and fears. Rachel found herself offering advice that she herself needed to hear. You deserve to be treated with respect, said Rachel, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. No one has the right to diminish or control you. When the young woman left, calmer and more determined, Rachel turned to the mirror. She looked deeply into her own eyes, seeing for the first time in years the woman she used to be strong, independent, full of dreams. At that moment, something changed inside her. A silent but powerful decision took shape in her heart. She didn't know exactly what she would do, but she knew she couldn't go on living like this. Rachel fixed her dress, touched up her makeup, and took a deep breath. As she left the bathroom, she heard the announcement that Daniel would be giving another speech. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. Walking back into the hall, Rachel felt like she was moving in slow motion. Each step took her closer to a turning point, a moment that would change everything. What would Daniel say this time? And more importantly, how would she respond? The answer would come soon, and Rachel, for the first time in years, was ready to face whatever came next. The hall fell silent as Daniel took to the stage again, his presence commanding immediate attention. Rachel positioned herself near the front, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and a strange sense of anticipation. My dear friends, Daniel began, his voice smooth as velvet. Tonight is about celebration, but it's also about gratitude. His eyes traveled through the crowd, finally landing on Rachel. And there's no one I owe more gratitude to than my lovely wife, Rachel. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Rachel felt the gazes turn to her, some curious, others envious. If only they knew, she thought. Rachel, my love, Daniel continued, holding out his hand towards her. Why don't you join me here? With hesitant steps, Rachel climbed onto the stage. Daniel wrapped her in a hug that, to the spectators, seemed affectionate, but she felt the tension in his muscles, the veiled threat in his touch. This wonderful woman has been my rock, my inspiration, Daniel declared, his arm firmly around Rachel's waist. She has sacrificed so much for me, for us. Rachel maintained a plastic smile, but inside a storm was beginning to brew. Daniel's every word sounded like a farce, a grotesque distortion of the reality she lived with every day. Of course, Daniel continued, his tone changing subtly. It wasn't always easy, was it, darling? He looked at Rachel, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Sometimes Rachel can be a bit distracted, a bit careless with our social responsibilities. The audience laughed politely, but Rachel felt the blow as if it were physical. She saw a few eyebrows rise, expressions of sympathy barely disguised. Remember the incident last year at the Rothschild dinner? Daniel continued, his voice now tinged with a false lightness. Rachel almost knocked over a bottle of 1869 Chateau Lafite on the Duchess of York. What a disaster that would have been, wouldn't it, dear? The laughter increased, but now there was an uncomfortable tone. Rachel felt the blush creep up her neck, the humiliation burning in her gut. But what can I say? Daniel shrugged, smiling. Beauty and grace don't always go together. Fortunately, I'm always here to guide you. It was at that moment that something inside Rachel broke. Years of submission, of forced silence, of stolen dignity, all culminated in this instant. She looked at Daniel, seeing him not as the powerful billionaire the world admired, but as the petty tyrant he really was. Actually, Daniel, Rachel heard her own voice, surprisingly firm, I think you're forgetting some important details of this story. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel froze, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Rachel, darling, he said between his teeth. This is not the time to. But Rachel was no longer listening. She stepped forward, away from Daniel's suffocating embrace, and picked up the microphone. Do you want to know what really happened that night? She asked the stunned audience. I almost knocked over that bottle because I was trying to dodge the wandering hands of a certain drunken guest. A guest that Daniel insisted I entertain in order to close a deal. Audible gasps echoed around the room. Daniel stepped forward, trying to regain control, but Rachel held up her hand, silencing him with a gesture. For years, I've been the perfect prop, the trophy wife you all envy, she continued, her voice gaining strength. But at what cost? My career, my dreams, my dignity. Rachel looked directly at Daniel, years of hurt and anger finally finding expression. You may have billions in the bank, Daniel, but your moral account has been in the red for a long time. Daniel's face contorted with anger, all pretense of civility disappearing. This is ridiculous, he snarled, trying to wrench the microphone out of Rachel's hands. You're making a scene. But Rachel dodged, her determination growing by the second. A scene? She laughed bitterly. No, Daniel. I'm finally showing the truth behind our perfect facade. Turning to the shocked audience, Rachel continued. You all admire him, envy him. But do you know what happens when the cameras go out? When there's no one to impress? The room was completely silent now, all eyes fixed on the drama unfolding on stage. Daniel, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, tried one last move. Rachel, you're clearly upset, he said, forcing a tone of concern. Maybe we should go home and talk in private. But Rachel didn't give in. Years of submission had given way to fierce determination. No, Daniel. No more private conversations. No more whispered threats. No more manipulation. She turned to face the audience once more, her voice trembling slightly but firm. I have a story to tell you all. A story about power, abuse, and the truth behind the Goldstein Empire. Daniel advanced, his face a mask of fury, but was stopped by security guards who, sensing the change in atmosphere, moved to protect Rachel. As she prepared to reveal years of guarded secrets, Rachel felt a mixture of terror and liberation. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, she knew her life would never be the same. And for the first time in years, that prospect didn't scare her. She was ready to face the storm she had summoned. The ballroom, once a sea of murmurs and muffled laughter, was now plunged into a sepulchral silence. All eyes were on Rachel, who held the microphone with trembling but determined hands. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure everyone could hear it. "Where to start?" Rachel said, her voice wavering at first, gaining strength with each word. "Perhaps the day I met Daniel Goldstein. I was a young architect, full of dreams and ambitions. He was Daniel Goldstein." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw shocked faces, curious ones, some even with a touch of empathy. Daniel, still next to her on stage, looked like a statue of restrained fury. "In the beginning it was like a fairy tale," Rachel continued. "Expensive dinners, exotic trips, promises of a bright future. But I soon realized that every gift, every grand gesture, came with a price." Her mind flashed back to one particular evening 4 years ago. She had just turned down an important project to accompany Daniel on a business trip. "You made the right choice, darling," Daniel had said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "After all, what kind of wife would you be if you weren't there for me when I need you?" Rachel swallowed, pushing the memory away. Gradually, my career, my friends, my independence. Everything faded away, and in its place came this polished, submissive version of myself. She looked directly at Daniel, years of hurt reflected in her eyes. "But the real Daniel Goldstein? He's not the generous philanthropist you all know. Behind closed doors, he's controlling, manipulative, and often cruel." A murmur of shock ran through the audience. Daniel stepped forward, his face a mask of restrained anger. "Rachel, this is absurd. You're clearly upset. Maybe we should—" "No!" Rachel interrupted him, her voice firm. "I'm not going to shut up anymore. I'm not going to pretend anymore." She turned to the audience, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you know why we're really here tonight? It's not about charity. It's about covering up Daniel's dirty dealings." The silence in the room was palpable. Rachel could feel the weight of every glance, the growing tension in the air. "The Goldstein empire," she continued, "was built on lies, manipulation, and in some cases, sheer intimidation. I've seen contracts forged, competitors threatened, politicians bought off." Daniel stepped forward, his facade of calm finally crumbling. "This is defamation. You have no proof." Rachel stared at him, years of fear giving way to fierce determination. "Oh, but I do, Daniel. Do you really think I've spent all these years by your side without learning anything?" She turned to a man in the front row, a familiar face among the guests. "Mr. Thompson, do you remember that special contract Daniel asked you to sign last year? The one that was supposed to be just a formality?" The man paled visibly, glancing nervously between Rachel and Daniel. "And you, Mrs. Patel," Rachel continued, addressing an elegant woman near the bar. "Remember the donation Daniel made to your husband's campaign? The one that came with so many strings attached?" The room erupted in murmurs. Daniel, realizing he was losing control of the situation, made one last desperate attempt. "This is crazy," he shouted, advancing towards Rachel. "Security! Get her out of here." But to everyone's surprise, especially Daniel's, the security guards didn't move. Instead, 2 of them discreetly positioned themselves between Rachel and Daniel. Rachel, feeling a surge of courage, stepped forward. "Do you want to know the truth about the great Daniel Goldstein? About how he really made his fortune? About the shady deals, the threats, the bribes?" She paused dramatically, her eyes scanning the room. "I have proof. Documents, emails, recordings, all stored in a safe place, ready to be revealed." Daniel's face lost all color. For the first time, Rachel saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Rachel," he said, his voice now a desperate whisper, "think carefully about what you're doing. Think about everything we've built. But Rachel could no longer hear him. Years of forced silence had given way to an avalanche of long-suppressed truths. "I thought, Daniel," she replied, her voice charged with emotion. "I thought about every moment you diminished me, every dream you crushed, every time you made me feel small and insignificant." Turning to the stunned audience, Rachel continued, "And now, I think of all the people who have been hurt by your actions. All the businesses destroyed, all the lives ruined." The hall was absolutely silent. Rachel could feel the weight of his words, the impact of each revelation. "Tonight," she concluded, her voice firm and clear, "is not just about exposing Daniel Goldstein. It's about giving a voice to everyone who has been silenced by his power and his greed." As she finished speaking, Rachel felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Years of secrets and lies had been exposed, and there was no going back. What would come next, she didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt truly free. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The silence that followed Rachel's words was almost palpable. The ballroom, once a scene of glamour and false appearances, now looked like a pressure cooker about to explode. The guests looked at each other, uncertain how to react to the shocking revelations. Then a deep, firm voice cut through the tense air. "I can confirm what Mrs. Goldstein is saying." All heads turned towards the source of the voice. Standing in the center of the room was Jonathan Stern, one of Daniel's oldest friends and associates. His normally jovial face was serious, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "Jonathan," Daniel hissed, his face contorted in a mixture of shock and betrayal. "What do you think you're doing?" Ignoring Daniel, Jonathan walked towards the stage, his posture erect and determined. "For years, I was a silent accomplice to Daniel's actions," he began, his voice carrying the weight of guilt. "I convinced myself that it was just business, that the end justified the means, but I can't live with that lie any longer." Rachel watched, stunned, as Jonathan took to the stage. She had never expected an ally, let alone one from Daniel's inner circle. What did Rachel say about forged contracts, threatened competitors, and bought politicians? "All true," Jonathan continued, facing the shocked stares of the audience. "I was witness to many of these actions myself." Daniel, realizing that he was rapidly losing control of the situation, tried one last desperate move. "This is absurd. Jonathan is obviously disturbed. Maybe he's had too much to drink." But his words were interrupted by another voice, this time coming from the back of the room. "I have something to say too." A middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed, stood up. Rachel recognized her as Sarah Lawson, a prominent financial journalist. "2 years ago, I was investigating some irregularities in the Goldstein business," Sarah began, her voice firm. "I received veiled threats, my apartment was raided, and I mysteriously lost my job. Now I know it was Daniel's doing." A murmur of indignation ran through the room. More people began to stand up, each with their own story to tell. "My company was forced into bankruptcy after I refused to sell to Goldstein," said one man. "I was blackmailed into keeping quiet about illegal labor practices in one of his factories," added a young executive. Rachel watched, a mixture of shock and relief taking hold of her. She was no longer alone. Each new voice that rose up was like a weight being lifted off her shoulders. Daniel, watching his empire of lies crumble before his eyes, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "Everything I've done has been for the greater good, to build something great." But his words fell on deaf ears. The room was now buzzing with conversations, accusations, and, surprisingly for Rachel, expressions of support directed at her. It was at this moment that a man in a discreet suit approached Daniel. Rachel recognized him as one of the company's lawyers. "Mr. Goldstein," he said in a low voice, but audible to those nearby. "I think you'd better accompany me. We have urgent matters to discuss." Daniel, for the first time that night, looked completely defeated. His face, once a mask of arrogance, was now pale and haggard. As Daniel was being escorted out of the hall, Rachel felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Jonathan. "Rachel," he said softly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm willing to testify about everything." Rachel nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "Thank you, Jonathan. That means a lot." As the buzz in the hall grew, Rachel found herself surrounded by people, some offering support, others wanting to share their own stories of abuse and manipulation at Daniel's hands. Amidst the chaos, Rachel spotted a familiar figure approaching. It was Michael, her old college classmate. "Rachel," he said, a gentle smile on his face, "you've been amazing. And, well, I don't know if this helps, but that architecture studio you've always dreamed of opening, I know a few people who would be more than willing to invest." For the first time that night, Rachel felt a genuine smile form on her lips. The road ahead would be long and difficult, she knew that. There would be legal battles, public scrutiny, and the painful task of rebuilding her life. But looking around, seeing the supportive faces, hearing the stories of others who had been silenced for so long, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced for years: hope. Daniel Goldstein's empire of lies was crumbling, and from the ashes, a new story was about to be written. A story of truth, justice, and perhaps most importantly, a fresh start. As the night wore on, Rachel knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, she was eager to take the next step. The first headlines were already circulating: "Goldstein's empire in collapse. Billionaire dismissed the fall of Daniel." The city was buzzing with the fallout from the scandal. At the public prosecutor's office, investigators worked tirelessly. Every document, every email from Daniel was a piece of a bigger puzzle. The defense lawyers were racing against time, trying to contain the information leaks. Rachel received a call from Sarah Lawson, the financial journalist. "We have more information that may be of interest to the investigation," she said. Documents showing Daniel's connections with corrupt politicians. Each new revelation was like a piece of a complex puzzle, exposing the true face of Daniel Goldstein. Rachel looked out of the car window. The city was preparing for a new day, a day that promised significant changes. "I'm ready," she whispered, to herself. The court battle would be long, but for the first time, Rachel wouldn't be fighting alone. She had allies, she had evidence, she had her own truth. Daniel Goldstein's empire was shaking at its foundations, and Rachel was determined to see its complete fall. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, cameras, anxious spectators, everyone was waiting for the decisive moment. Rachel sat in the front row, her body tense but her face serene. Daniel Goldstein entered escorted, no longer the imposing man he was before. His expensive suit looked loose, his shoulders bowed by the weight of impending guilt. Jonathan Stern was the first to testify. His words were like knives, cutting through the facade of respectability that Daniel had built up for years. "It wasn't just corruption," Jonathan declared. "It was a deliberate system of manipulation and destruction. Documents were presented, compromising emails, spreadsheets revealing bribes, recordings of conversations that exposed criminal strategies. Each piece of evidence was a blow to Daniel's empire. The prosecution presented a detailed timeline of the criminal actions. Dozens of companies destroyed, lives ruined, dreams trampled on. The portrait of Daniel was one of an unscrupulous corporate predator. "He didn't build an empire," said the prosecutor. "He built a house of cards made of lies and manipulation." Daniel remained impassive, but Rachel could see the panic growing in his eyes. His world was falling apart, piece by piece. Then came the moment no one expected. The Duchess of York testified, revealing the harassment and blackmail that Daniel practiced in elite social circles. He believed that money and power made him untouchable, she declared. Today we proved him wrong. Rachel watched, feeling a mixture of relief and deep sadness. It wasn't revenge she felt, but liberation. Confidential documents were revealed. Money, laundering schemes, tax fraud, manipulation of competitors. The Goldstein empire was collapsing like a sandcastle. The judge listened attentively, his expression becoming increasingly grave. When he finally spoke, his voice echoed through the courtroom. "The evidence is irrefutable," he declared. "Daniel Goldstein, you will be prosecuted for multiple corporate crimes." Daniel tried to protest, but his voice came out as a pathetic whisper. His lawyers exchanged defeated glances. The sentence would be handed down soon, but everyone there knew Daniel Goldstein was already defeated. His empire, built on lies, had completely collapsed. Rachel felt something she hadn't expected: compassion. Not for Daniel, but for the version of him that might have existed before the power consumed him. When Daniel was taken away, his eyes met Rachel's for a brief moment. There was no anger, no hatred, just the recognition of a truth finally exposed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, reporters fired off messages, cameras flashed. An era had ended. Rachel took a deep breath. Her journey of liberation was complete. What came next was completely uncharted territory, and for the first time, that excited her. The sun was rising over New York, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. For Rachel, that light represented more than just the start of a new day. It was the dawn of a new life. Sitting in her new apartment, a modest but bright space in Brooklyn, Rachel watched the city awaken. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions and transformations. The case against Daniel had been brutal. Media, lawyers, investigations. But the truth had prevailed. His empire was completely destroyed. Shares frozen, accounts blocked, reputation in tatters. Jonathan Stern had been instrumental. His testimony, together with the documents Rachel had obtained, provided irrefutable proof of Daniel's criminal practices. Bribes, fraud, market manipulation, it all came to light. Her phone vibrated, a message from Michael, her old college classmate. "The architecture studio is ready. When do you want to meet?" Rachel smiled. After years of stifling her dreams, she finally had the chance to start again. The initial investment came from an unexpected source, the Duchess of York, who had become an ally after the revelations about Daniel. The doorbell rang. It was her lawyer, Sandra. "We have good news," she said, entering. "Daniel has accepted a plea bargain, house arrest and confiscation of assets. But most importantly, you will receive significant compensation." Rachel wasn't interested in money. Her real wealth was her newly won freedom. "What about the other cases?" she asked. Many of Daniel's victims had found the courage to come forward after his testimony. "Ongoing," Sandra replied. "His testimony has inspired dozens of people to break their silence." At midday, Rachel had a meeting in the new studio. Projects were waiting. For her projects that would be built with integrity, not manipulation. Her cell phone rang. It was the producer of a television program. "We want to make a documentary about your story," they said, "to show how it's possible to break free from abusive relationships." Rachel hesitated at first, but she realized that her story could help other women. "Let's talk," she replied. The afternoon was spent organizing her new office. Plants, a computer, a framed photo of her mother, symbols of new beginnings and hope. In the evening, she received one last surprise: an envelope. Inside was a letter from an institution that supports women victims of domestic violence. "Your courage has saved many lives," the letter read. "We want to invite you to be our spokesperson." Rachel felt tears well up in her eyes. Not of sadness, but of liberation. The phone vibrated again. A message from an unknown number. You don't know it, but you inspired my daughter to leave an abusive marriage. Thank you. That message was worth more than any compensation. As night fell over New York, Rachel looked out of the window. Her life had changed completely in a matter of weeks, from silent wife to symbol of resistance. The future was a blank page, and for the first time, she could choose how to fill it in. Her new architecture project awaited. Her voice was free. Her story, far from over, was just beginning. Social media exploded. Businessmen who once feared Daniel now competed to distance themselves from him. His calls, his contacts, everything was being scrutinized. An unexpected phone call came from the consulate. International investors were beginning to withdraw their investments from Daniel's companies. The financial empire was crumbling fast. Jonathan Stern remained a key player. His detailed testimony exposed years of criminal practices. It wasn't a mistake, he would tell investigators. It was a deliberate system of corruption. Rachel knew the battle was just beginning. Daniel would not give in easily. His lawyers were known for destroying reputations and buying silences. A new source got in touch, a former employee of Daniel's willing to reveal insider secrets. Each new piece of information was like another nail in the coffin of the Goldstein empire. Rachel's phone kept ringing. Journalists, lawyers, people wanting to tell their stories of how they had been hurt by Daniel. "He destroyed my company," said one businessman. "Now I want justice." The international media began to cover the case. From New York to London, the Goldstein scandal made headlines. Daniel was trying one last trick. His lawyers filed lawsuits, sought injunctions, tried to stop the leak. But it was too late. Rachel was given police protection. She knew that Daniel would do anything to silence her. But this time she wasn't alone. Jonathan found her in a discreet cafe. "We have enough evidence for a trial that will put you in jail for decades," he said. By now, the siege was complete. Government agencies, the media, investors, everyone had turned against Daniel. A final twist awaited. And Rachel knew that the worst or the best, was yet to come. The first lights of dawn painted the New York sky as Rachel left the hotel. The night before seemed like a surreal dream, or more precisely, a nightmare finally interrupted. Journalists huddled outside, cameras and microphones ready. She knew that every step would be documented, every expression analyzed. But something inside her had changed. The fear that had paralyzed her before now drove her forward. "Mrs. Goldstein!" the reporters shouted. "How are you feeling after the revelations?" Rachel chose her words carefully. "The truth always finds its way to the light," she replied, her voice firm and controlled. A black car pulled up next to them. The window rolled down, revealing Jonathan Stern. "We need to talk," he said. "We have documents that can corroborate your accusations." Inside the car, away from prying eyes, Jonathan spread out a series of folders. Documents, emails, spreadsheets, an explosive archive that proved decades of Daniel's manipulations. "Has he always been like this?" Rachel asked, leafing through the documents. Jonathan sighed heavily. "No. In the beginning, Daniel was different. Ambitious, yes, but not cruel. Power changed him." Each document revealed a deeper layer of corruption. Bribes to politicians, fraudulent contracts, manipulation of competitors. Daniel's empire was not built on success, but on the ruins of other lives. "He has powerful lawyers," Jonathan warned. "He'll fight with all his might to destroy your credibility." Rachel knew this tactic. She had been a victim of it for years. "I'm ready," she replied. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "We need to meet. I have information that Daniel wants to keep secret." The source? A former employee dismissed by Daniel years ago. Rachel hesitated, aware of the risks. In the prosecutor's office, a prosecutor was watching the recordings from the night before. "This changes everything," he muttered to himself. Rachel received a phone call. It was her lawyer. "Search and seizure warrant at Goldstein's offices. We found additional evidence. The judicial machine was starting to move. Daniel, who hours before had seemed untouchable, was now seeing his empire crumble. In Daniel's office, the chaos was total. Files were being removed, computers seized. Years of secrets were about to be exposed. Rachel knew the battle was just beginning. Daniel would not give in easily. He would use every resource, every connection to defend himself. A new message on his phone. This time from an unexpected source, the Duchess of York, the same one Daniel had mentioned at the ball. "I'm willing to testify," the message said. "He harassed me at a private event 2 years ago. I have proof." The siege was closing in.